Okay, we are recording. I'm with Russell. This is going to be the second part of this discussion, conversation, interview, whatever you want to call it. And this is a bit more abstract and academic, but again, this is kind of like a big part of my research and my written component, whatever we want to call that. But the written aspect of this project is dealing with three components that I think are pretty essential to understanding Chinese culture. If you want to know something about Chinese culture, these are three of the things that sort of came to mind. And there's other things, but the three I want to focus on are face, collectivism, and Confucianism. So I just want to again turn it over to you and ask you to again face collectivism, Confucianism. What's your sort of one by one? We'll start with face. What's your understanding of it? Like what do you think it means? How does it sort of manifest in the culture or the classroom? What's your understanding?
Okay, so yeah, as you mentioned, face is quite a big staple of the Chinese culture, and you see it in all areas, not just education, but of course areas in work and everyday life. Um, but if we're focusing simply on education, I would say that face often is the fear of making a mistake in public, saying the wrong thing, and kind of being reprimanded or feeling embarrassed, but to a much higher degree in front of people. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, losing face is seen as quite a serious problem in the Chinese culture, and people will go to great lengths to avoid losing face, um,
right.
which can also cause problems in itself. Um, but yeah, especially within education, for example, if you call on a student to answer a question and perhaps they don't know the answer, they will just not give you an answer. Or
Uh-huh.
perhaps they know the answer or they think they know, but they're so worried about losing face or not getting the question exactly right that they would just rather not speak out and be silent. And yeah, you see this quite often. You could ask any kind of question within the classroom related to what you're teaching, and it's very unlikely you'll get more than a few people, more than a few students at a time come to answer a question, and much more likely you're to see no response from the students
Yeah,
whenever a question is put out there and asked. And
right.
I think that is simply down to worried about losing face. It's yeah, especially in education, it's a big thing, and uh, and yeah, I come across this very early on when I came to
Yeah.
China, and all the way through you see this, and as we mentioned before, our job is kind of to, as a teacher, at least personally, I find my job is to kind of undo a little bit of this issue. Yeah, kind of
Yeah.
undo, pick apart that, and I try to,
Deprogram.
yeah, a little bit, and I feel like in the classroom I try to have kind of like a Western influence. So when you're walking into the classroom, it's almost like the Chinese culture isn't as strong. I try
Yeah.
to keep it that way, but obviously it's very difficult to undo years and years of this belief system. And I
Conditioning. Yeah.
conditioning, yeah, sure. And I'm not there to undo that. I don't want to change the way Chinese people are. That's not my job, and I don't think
Sure.
it's a job for anyone to do that. But it just makes it very difficult to teach. So you have to kind of teach around this, and by being aware of face in the classroom, yeah, I think that's the most important thing. Be aware of it so you can teach in a way that can um, kind of overcome it as opposed to being hindered by it.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah. Okay, good. All right, so the next one, collectivism. What's your understanding of, I think you would agree with me that China is a collectivist culture, and your culture and my culture, which, in a lot of ways are similar, um, are individualistic, I would say. I'm sure you would agree with that. So, what is your understanding of China as a collectivist culture? And again, how do you think this might manifest or influence education?
Okay, so first of all, I think, at least in my opinion, I believe that collectivism isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I think it's all too
Sure.
easy, especially being from a Western country, to say, oh, they're very collectivist. they put everybody first and there's no individualism and that's a bad thing. I don't think that at all. But I do think there are some negative things that do come out of a collectivist society, and that is very much ingrained in the education system. So, for example, when you've got a lot of people that are seen as more like an in-group, versus an out-group, I think of it in terms of psychological theories. When I'm talking about like social psychology, for example, I see it as more like an in-group and out-group thing. So as a foreigner coming into China, you're very much on the outskirts. You're very much the out-group. And when you have a tight-knit collectivist Chinese society, you will always be on the outskirts. And I know that isn't just a Chinese thing. You have this in Japan, or is it gaijin, right? The term
Gaijin,
foreigner. Yeah, and you're always seen as an outsider. And I don't think, that's just a Chinese thing. But I think simply now, when it comes to Chinese culture now, because they were closed off for so much because of the history, there are very few foreigners compared to how big the country is as a whole. There's very few foreigners and foreign influence in China, and they're very much aware of that. And because of that, when you come to China, there's always that barrier. So when you come into a teacher class, there is already this barrier to overcome. They see you as a foreigner. They see you as someone different. Quite often, they might not want to take on board what you're saying or agree with what you're saying simply because you are an outsider. It's very difficult to pass that barrier.
Yeah, I agree. And if you don't mind me jumping in,
sure.
You mentioned in Japan they have the word gaijin. Now, this is for the benefit of the audience, but two of the words they use to call foreigners, you'll hear a lot, if you recognize it, are Laowai and Waiguoren. Now, they both have the same character, I think, the same, the Y.
Yeah.
And that literally, to what you're saying, means like out or outside. And like a Waiguoren literally means like out or outside country person.
Yeah. That's what they're referring to. So I think that's a good point, and I think it's useful to explain that and go into a bit more detail for those who don't speak Chinese, which is a lot of people probably listening to this right now. You have Laowai and Waiguoren, and in my opinion, at least I've seen that Laowai is kind of seen as a bit more respectful, because in Chinese culture and the language, when they use this character Lao, which means old,
or venerable,
it's usually a term of respect or someone of great power or influence.
Right. Like, I think it's the same as Lao Shi, right? Like the same Lao from teacher, Lao Shi.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same one. So Lao Shi for teacher being like old. I think Shi is like master, so it's like an old master, and Lao Wai is kind of like an old outsider. So it's almost it's a term of respect, but it's also denoting that you are a foreigner. Whereas the word Waiguoren, is just kind of referring to somebody of a different race outside of Chinese. And
there's two groups of people. There's Chinese and there's foreigners, and that's it.
Definitely. And you can kind of understand that the problems they get when you see Chinese people in other countries and you call them a foreigner, they kind of don't understand, because they've always seen themselves as themselves. And I think that kind of comes from a little bit of the historic kind of background, being that because of since the 80s, China was a very closed off society. They had very little influence and foreigners coming in. So when you go to China as a foreigner or a white person, if you're white, you're coming over, it may be the first time they see a foreigner.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And this is an issue. When you're walking around the streets, people will come up to you and point at you and call you a foreigner to your face, because it's just so surprising to them. And I think that's another thing. People will often point at you, take photos of you, videos of you, or want to have a photo taken with you, or want to practice their English with you because you're a foreigner. And I think that is because there aren't that many there. And for a lot of people, especially the older generation, it may be the first time they've ever seen a foreigner.
Right. And for us, where we grew up, and this is a lot of parts of the world, if I saw an Asian or a Chinese or a Korean person, Far Eastern person, it wouldn't shock me. You know, again, where I grew up, I saw so many different types of people and groups and shapes and sizes and hair colors and hairstyles and fashion, and it just, you know, I was exposed to so much, as I imagine you, or at least compared to Chinese people. But again, in Chinese, they're so, yeah, collective and homogenous in so
Yeah.
many ways,
Yeah.
that anything slightly different to them is, and I often joke, I've probably said this to you 1,000 times, but yeah, I get kind of frustrated or irritated sometimes with all the unwanted attention I get, especially me, because I'm really big, I'm really tall, I'm very, very white. I get a lot of attention. I don't blend in. And what I often have said to people over the years is, you know, I understand for a lot of these people, this is their first time to ever see a foreigner. But what they don't understand is that for me, it's like the 1 millionth time I've encountered someone who's never seen a foreigner. So for them, it's like this new exciting. It's almost like, you know, you go to Disneyland or you go on a tour, you go somewhere your first time, and it's exciting. But maybe for the tour guide who's there all day, every day for years, it's like just the same thing over and over and over, and it's kind of
Right.
tiresome and redundant.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's important to point out, when you go to Disneyland, you don't see the Disneyland characters and Disney characters being sour or moody or annoyed with you, because they know that, for them it might be the millionth kid they've seen this month, but for you it's the first time going there and they have to make it special. And I always feel like that in China when I go there. I feel like I try my best to be kind of open and friendly towards all the Chinese people that I meet, but it soon becomes very tiring and draining
Yeah.
on you to be like
Yeah,
that. And that
very.
and I
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is to do with the collectivism. I think it's very much us versus them, and I think that can be very problematic as well in terms of differing opinions.
All right.
th-
And that's kind of where I want to go next, if you don't mind,
so
is opinions. Like, again, when I think of collectivism, I know it can manifest in different ways, and you have the family unit and things like that, and in some positive ways as well. But I'm thinking, again, specifically, I'd wonder if you could say something about maybe collectivism and like thought and like opinions in China versus, again, like a Western country.
okay, so from what I mean, a lot of this is kind of my experience, and not being a Chinese person, it can be difficult to interpret, how Chinese people think or act. And before, from what I've experienced, and um, in a general kind of observational way, you often see Chinese people speaking in a way where they are very, as you say, collectivist. They have their own opinions. Quite often, their opinions come from the state, or
Yes.
yeah, and they're very state thought driven. And to be
Hmm.
honest, I don't mean this in a negative way, and I don't think one way is better than the other. I just think it's different. But from when I do occasionally come into contact with Chinese people that think differently, it is such a breath
Uh-huh.
of fresh air. It is so
Yeah.
kind of like finding a needle in a haystack in a way. To find a Chinese person that thinks differently, acts differently, or maybe has a different kind of questioning mind. And you often see that those are the students that are doing better in English, because they're not
Yeah.
learning
Yeah.
it because the
Yeah.
state told them to or the school told them to. They're learning it because they have a genuine interest, and that's another thing. I think it's very difficult to take another language, and not want to learn the culture. But that's kind of how they do it
Yeah.
in China. They expect you to learn English, but not indulge in the culture. They expect you to learn the language,
Yeah.
but not like the food. Don't watch the movies. Don't read the books. Don't learn about their English history or British history or American history. Just learn the language. It's a tool for you to pass the test and get a better job. It's very pragmatic in that way. And sometimes I do feel
Yeah.
it is a bit better because you're not overburdening yourself with it, but also it can be very stifling, creativity wise. And
Yeah.
I, yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I don't think it's the best way to learn. And I think that does stem from the collective mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was just thinking too, in terms of, again, there's always exceptions, and what people say in public, they may not necessarily believe in private. I think often they do. I think there's a lot of true believers, not all, some just, they just don't want to rock the boat, and that's fine. I understand that. But I do find there does in general, again, we're talking about 1.5 billion people, but there is such a uniformity often from again, my own experiences of just opinions or reactions, or often if I go in and teach a class and we talk about a topic, I'll get a certain set of stock responses.
Yeah.
And then I know almost exactly how the rest of the classes on the same topic are going to be for that day or that week. And then it's sure enough, here come the same sort of stock phrases or opinions or quotes from the state or quotes from Marx or whatever. And sometimes, and this might sound a bit harsh, but sometimes the answers can be so generic that I almost feel like the students are just interchangeable.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think
Yeah.
I think you make a great point of saying that just because they say something in public, that they may not believe that privately, especially when they're talking to foreigners. They're not going to reveal their kind of, private life or private feelings, because they have a fear of being reprimanded for it, and that does kind of influence and come back a little bit to face. But also, they are afraid of the government, and the government is very, very strong on kind of free speech and free thought in a way, and that does kind of stem back to collectivism as well. You're expected to speak this way, think this way, and if you think or speak out in any different way, Chinese history has shown us that is not a good idea.
Yeah, they definitely emphasize conformity and
And one thing I did want to mention quickly is that I personally, and I feel like the same with a lot of foreigners, I feel like I'm constantly censoring myself in China. When I first went, the first thing they said to me was the 3 T's that you're not allowed to mention. I think those T's, right? The 3 things.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny though, because I think almost everyone I've spoken so far, that's come up, and that again, I hope anyone listening to this and hearing all these, the overlap between conversations would realize that if you got 4 or 5 different people bringing up some of the same points, but again, the 3 T's. Go ahead and explain those.
Okay, well, I'm glad the other people have said it in the other interviews, because obviously I haven't heard them, so it's nice to hear a little bit of going on. Anyway, the 3 T's: Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen Square. Those are the 3 T's that we are not allowed to kind of discuss or converse about in the classroom. And I have to point this out. It's not a written law. There's nowhere in the contract saying you can't talk about these 3 things. And that's another problem, is that it's so bad to talk about these things that they won't even put it in public. They won't even write it down. You're just expected to know. And they will pull you up. Yeah, exactly. An unwritten rule that you're expected to abide by, or you will be reprimanded, or perhaps fired, or even blacklisted from China. And it has happened. I think we've known people.
Seen it.
Yeah, we've seen it. We've known people that have spoken out of line about something, and they've been told to issue an apology or a written letter apologizing for the way they're thinking or what they've said, and it's incorrect. And this kind of stems back to the collectivist thinking. You're not allowed to speak.
And that's let me jump in real quick. That's what they did with the coronavirus when the doctors started speaking out. There's that one who's become famous, and he literally had to I think retract what he said for quote unquote spreading rumors, and they had him sign a document, and they published it, and it's got his finger or thumbprints and the red ink, and so it's they definitely monitor what you can
control
and can't
free
say.
Speech. And you see that a lot in Hong Kong now. They've just signed a new law into place saying that you are not allowed to speak out about certain subjects, about freedom of speech, about political political differences with the party, and very
Yeah.
much coming back to mainland, talking about mainland life, the party is something you are not allowed to criticize, and quite
Yeah.
often I go through lengths to not even mention the
Yeah.
party, and
Yeah.
I have to mention that every classroom in China has a camera in it.
Yes.
At
Yes,
least
they
every
do.
classroom that I've been in has CCTV in it, and quite often when you kind of get on a more risque kind of topic that you want to talk about, and I do like to talk about those topics because that's what gets students kind of thinking a bit more creatively. Let's talk about things that you wouldn't usually talk about within limits. Let's talk
Yeah,
about
within
gay
limits.
marriage. Let's talk about something like that. So maybe a topic that is in itself inherently controversial in any culture, in any country. And I like to throw that in the mix just to see, is there anyone here that will go against the grain, speak out? And I don't want to push the psychology part too much of this, but there is kind of overlaps there with certain research or famous psychological experiments. One that comes to mind is the Milgram experiment, where you are told to
All right.
electrocute somebody.
Right.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I feel like sometimes. Is there, everybody is willing to buzz in and electrocute somebody? Is there someone willing to stand up and go against the grain? I'm going to say this thing. Is there anyone here willing to disagree with me or agree with me or talk about something from another perspective? And that's kind of what I try to push in the classroom, because I know they're not going to get it anywhere else.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, like you, I think myself and a lot of us, we do try to promote creativity and critical thinking, but yeah, within certain limits. And yeah, generally, if my advice to any new teachers would be, if you're unsure, just don't bother. If you have any doubt,
Yeah.
don't bring it up. Like
Yeah,
take some time, stay,
especially with the
yeah,
new teachers.
stay within safe, yeah, yeah, stay within safe, non-controversial boundaries, and then maybe once you get familiar and people start to open up, maybe you can sort of get a sense of what's okay. But yeah, don't criticize the government, don't bring up the 3Ts, certain things. Just it's not going to get you anywhere but in trouble. So good. Now the last point I want to talk a little bit about or hear your thoughts about is Confucianism. I realize neither of us are Confucian scholars, but I think we're both somewhat aware of who Confucius was. I've been reading a lot about him recently, and everything I've kind of read about him the past several months, because I've been trying to, learn more for my project. Everything I've kind of researched has sort of just verified what I already knew about him, or the opinions I already had. I don't feel like I came across anything and thought, oh, that's totally new. I just thought like, okay, this confirms what I already thought or believed or read about him years ago. So anyway, I'm rambling a bit. So what do you know about like Confucianism? And again, how do you think that sort of influences the culture, education, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's an important point to mention, and I think Chinese philosophy in general can be very interesting, and you can't study or talk about Chinese philosophy without talking about Confucius or Confucianism in general. Um, Obviously, in Chinese we call him Kongzi, right? And we
Yeah.
have these, and people in China right now, even though it's very old kind of philosophical ideas and teachings, it is still relevant in China today, and you see that in
Yes.
the statues that they still make. They have areas where you can go and visit his hometown, and they have tours, and the books are still being published about it, and people are still talking about it today. And if you are someone who's interested in learning Chinese or Chinese culture, maybe you've heard of the Confucius Institute, named after
Yeah.
Confucius, obviously himself, who is, a major philosopher in Chinese culture and the history. So it's
Yeah.
still very relevant today, and I feel like with the geopolitical kind of things happening right now with China and the rest of the world, I think people are kind of seeing Confucius, the
Connection's
Confucius
breaking up a little bit. Sorry.
oh, sorry. Sorry.
Oh, okay, Confucius. Okay, yeah, connection's a little bit weak.
How's it now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little bit better. So you were talking about the geopolitical
Like
situation in the
climate.
Confucius
Yeah.
Institutes.
Yeah, I think that they're coming under fire a little bit more recently because they're seeing it as Chinese kind of pushing their culture and language further into other countries and maybe even influencing policies. Obviously, I don't know too much about these things, but I think it's just important to remember that Confucius now and Confucianism in general is still very much alive and well in the Chinese culture at the moment. Um,
Yeah.
I'm not going to
Now,
pretend to be an
one
expert
point I
in
want to.
sure,
Sure.
sure.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, there's a little bit of an audio lag, so sorry if I talk over you.
That's okay.
Not intentional. Now, you mentioned something about statues, and again, maybe you've had a different experience than I have in this regard. But one of the things, and I think I included this in the first chapter of my writing. One of the things when I went to China that I was expecting was I thought I would see a lot more statues of more people. I thought they're going to have ancient, they always talk about 5,000 years of history. So I thought, oh, they're going to have all these different like statues of emperors and Confucius and Lao Tzu. And then when I got to China, and again, like you, I've traveled around, the most common statues I see are Mao Zedong. And that's not to say that you can't find statues of Confucius or other, literal or historical or mythological, persons. But honestly, how common is it to find a Confucius statue compared to like a Mao Zedong statue?
Yeah,
At least in your
yeah,
experience.
yeah. Okay, so in my experience, it pretty much echoes what you were saying there in the fact that how many Mao statues do you see for any other kind of philosopher or Chinese writer or poet or something like that? Yeah, you don't see them. You don't see them very often at all. I think in my whole time in China and every city I've been to, I've only ever seen one Confucius statue. Um, how many Mao
Yeah.
Zedong statues have I seen? Well, there was one in the school I was teaching at, which I would see every day walking past, and it is huge. It towers over some of the buildings
Yes.
nearby. The statue is huge, and you often see Mao Zedong statues. I actually went out of my way while I was in Shenzhen, which is a city in the south bordering on Hong Kong. So it's in mainland, but it borders Hong Kong. Um, I was lucky enough to go and visit Shenzhen, and when I went there, I actually went out of my way to find the statue of Deng Xiaoping, who was kind of the founder of the city of Shenzhen and a push
Right.
towards the opening of China and the Western, a bit more Western kind of culture or influence in a more positive way. And although people do tend to see Deng Xiaoping as a kind of revolutionary in a way, in a positive way, he is kind of hidden away. They tuck him under the carpet a little bit,
Right.
and I think that's because
Right.
the way that he went around things was very much capitalistic and money driven, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I think that helped open China towards negotiation, towards trade deals with the West, information back and forward, language and culture sharing. Without Deng Xiaoping, I don't think China would be where it is today. And you have these areas like Shanghai and Beijing and Guangzhou, Shenzhen, the big four cities, and it's because of Deng
Yeah.
Xiaoping that we have these massive metropolis. But Chongqing as well. I think we have these massive kind of metropolises and known as special economic areas or regions, and they're very much
Yeah.
built in the way to develop the culture and develop the economy, start earning money, to start, everything is made in China now, and that's the import and export business is huge. And I think without
Yeah.
him, there would be no current China. But yet, how many statues do you see of him? Yeah, I've only ever seen the one.
Right. 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 Hello?
Yeah, I'm here, still
Okay.
here.
Yeah. So one. Yeah. Yeah. And that was, again, I think that was back to an earlier question, that again was one of the surprises. Like again, when I went to China, maybe I had again kind of a romanticized, unrealistic version, but I thought, oh, there's going to be like language centers everywhere, so it's going to be really easy for me to take Chinese classes. And I know, it's sometimes really hard to arrange Chinese lessons in China, which is hard to
Yeah.
believe, like outside of China. But I remember like, yeah, like because we worked together. You had some you were very, very proactive in trying to get lessons, and sometimes it's just really difficult. And I thought too, like there would be, you go around in America and you see like little dojos where you can study karate or taekwondo. Like it's not too hard to sign up for lessons. And I thought in China, yeah, I'll go to China and I'll study Chinese and I'll sign up for some like kung fu lessons, and just couldn't like find anything,
Yeah.
really surprised me. Like, but that's totally different territory. So anyway, want to again go back to Confucius. We went off on a very interesting tangent. I enjoyed that, but I want to come back to Confucius and again, kind of. So yeah, he's very, very influential, but you don't see a lot of statues of him or whatever. But how in what ways do you think he's influential? Like what do you know about his teachings, and how do you think they sort of influence the culture inside and outside of the classroom maybe?
Okay. Yeah. Confucianism. Again, I'm not going to say I'm an expert in it. I haven't read up all that much about it, but from what I've seen, what I've heard, when I speak to people about Confucianism, my own experiences within the classroom and outside of the classroom, as well as speaking to people of different faiths in China. Obviously, we have things like Taoism and other areas like that. When I think about Confucianism, especially in the classroom, I see it's very much the eldest or the elder person, the teacher, head of the classroom, facing the front, giving their opinions, teaching their materials, and you are there to learn, to listen, and not to question. Most importantly, never to question the
Yeah,
teachings. And in a way, it
yeah,
is almost a tool to, again, at least in my opinion, to kind of control the students,
yeah,
control people through these teachings, through this method of teaching. And you see this very
yeah,
often in the classroom, simply when you take something like the classroom layout. And I think the West was very quick to jump on this. They found that, okay, having the teacher at the head of the classroom and everybody in singular rows isn't perhaps not the most useful way to transfer knowledge and teach
yeah,
students. We have areas in the West, for example, where you have groups or chairs that are movable, or you have computer rooms that are, staggered out seats. We have everyone in a circle, more like a focus group or something like that. Different approaches. And
right,
in
right.
5,000 years of Chinese history, the classrooms haven't changed at all. You will still see the teacher at the front of the classroom. You will still see rows and rows of seats and tables. Simply without the interest of changing the way that the education is. They are very happy with the teacher at the front. You are not to question the teacher. You will address them as Lao Shi, which is obviously the word teacher in Chinese, but they have this
Yeah,
connotation of Lao, old.
yeah,
You should respect your elders. This is very much ingrained in the Chinese culture, and
yeah,
yeah, especially education wise, you see it as a way to just control students. And I think this kind of influences other areas, but also plays very much into the idea of faith. You don't question the teacher, or the teacher will reprimand you, and then the conclusion to that would be you lose faith. So it very
mhm,
much is kind of like an area that all of these things are kind of interacting, but they
yeah,
are, themselves very strong, independent ideas that are in place. And yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but when we're in teaching at universities, for example, you will find that the chairs and tables are often bolted down to the floors.
Yes,
There is
yes.
no need to move the tables and chairs. There's no need to change the layout of a classroom. You are there to sit down, and you are not to move. You are not to question what is being taught in the classroom on a mental kind of psychological level, but also on a physical level. You can't move the chairs. You can't move these
Right.
tables.
Yeah,
You are
literally, yeah.
stuck where you are, and I think that's and I think that psychologically you're kind of imprisoned in the classroom, and
Yeah,
physically you are stuck in your seat.
yeah. And that's not necessarily every classroom, because like you, I've taught in several, but it's definitely not uncommon. It's definitely not
Sure,
uncommon.
sure. I
There
don't
are
think that's
some schools where
yeah.
you can
I
move,
agree.
but yeah,
Yeah, I was just going to say I don't think that that's maybe not a staple of every single classroom, but I think it's a staple of every single Chinese teacher to teach it that way.
sure, sure. And yeah, I agree. I think one of the big points of Confucianism is, yeah, respect for elders, and authority. And we won't go into that too much more. I think we hit enough points. But my overall, I want to throw in my overall sort of takeaway from Confucius is he seems very. You mentioned, Chinese are kind of pragmatic, and I would agree with that. In a lot of ways, they're very practical, and in some ways they're not. But I look at Confucius as a very sort of practical, pragmatic philosopher, very sort of grounded with daily affairs, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We kind of need that, but I find him much less interesting than a lot of other Chinese philosophers. When I've looked at Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi, I find them so much more interesting. Lao Tzu, especially, like all the Taoist philosophers, it's a lot more, abstract and metaphysical, and to me, a lot more engaging, kind of like, the ancient Greek philosophers, or at least some of them. But with Confucius, I find him just very, very, very grounded, very, very practical. But that's about it.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah,
I think
that's
when you're talking about a country with such huge amount of a population, the population is so huge. I think when it comes to Confucianism, during a time when China was a bit more disbanded, and I think this was a great way to kind of control the masses a little bit. But that's not to say China is the only place that does this. You could argue that religion did the same thing in the West. It was a way of teaching to
sure.
be submissive. So I don't think it is just a Chinese thing, but the difference is that there is kind of freedom of religion, freedom of choice in the US or the UK that you don't seem to see in China. And are people kind of pushing for Confucianism? It's still very much alive and well in the Chinese kind of culture, but I think it's adapted and changed over the years into something maybe a little bit more different, but also still the same. It's being rebranded, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Confucianism it's the same thing. It's being sold and packaged as communism now, or it's being sold
Yeah,
as
yeah,
packaged as something different, as like
yeah. That's a good point.
being submissive to your elders, for example. That might just be a new rebranding of what it was like to be under Confucianism then.
Sure. Yeah, and I've often thought that, yeah, it's convenient for them to sort of adopt or rebrand Confucianism, because it can sort of, I'm trying to think of the right way to say it. It can overlap, I guess, with communist ideals, and they can sort of, I think, use it to justify certain ideology. One point I want to make, though, and then maybe we'll complete this section, is you mentioned, Western religions, like Judaism, Christianity, versus Confucianism, and I don't disagree with that. But again, I can't help but sort of think that when I think of Western religious traditions, again, they're more like metaphysical. There are some practical applications, and I think there's some good teachings and things that came from it, and you can again find some similarities. I think like both Jesus and Confucius said, or allegedly said, basically the golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated. I think, again, both Jesus and Confucius, so that's interesting. But I still find with Confucius, he is so much day to day, and with Western religions, maybe not Judaism as much as Christianity, but there is these abstract ideas and beliefs, and I just don't find that in Confucianism.
Yeah, I think it does kind of struggle to explain, some of these terms. But I do think that it does try to, and I think that's the most important thing, that it does, sometimes it does try to explain, and that was kind of a push, perhaps in the right direction in some ways, philosophically, maybe that was a good thing. But I think that maybe Kongzi or Confucius himself doesn't represent just Confucianism in general, and I think it's easy to just label Confucius as the end all and be all of Confucianism. Yeah, he was a figurehead, but I think maybe there was a lot more being done. Obviously, I'm not an expert from what I've read. I just feel like maybe it's too easy just to say Confucianism is all about Confucius himself and what he wrote and what he does. I think there was some kind of interpretation, some other books that were written that would try to explain maybe some more of these metaphysical ideas and philosophy, kind of like Plato in a way.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I agree with you to a point that Confucianism is just more than Confucius. And again, like you, I'm also not an expert. So, disclaimer, I reserve the right to be wrong, because, but again, I have this sense from, again, my limited knowledge, my limited study of the whole field of Confucianism is, again, it seems to be very grounded in just day-to-day reality. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But when I think of like Plato, for example, I feel like his Chinese equivalent is more like Lao Tzu, and the Tao Te Ching and Tai Chi and Yin and Yang and things like that. But again, that's something else that could be a very, very long discussion. And I think we've said enough.
I think I just want to say quickly that I think that maybe it had the potential to be bigger or more influential or more impactful in a way that was a bit more metaphysical or in other ways. But I do believe that it was a bit more like the government suppressing. And I hate to kind of throw them under the bus a lot, but and that's not the only example. When you look at something like other areas of Chinese religion or followings or teaching, kind of like Tai Chi or something like that, you do often see when anything gets too big, the government kind of steps in a little bit and reminds you, and I think you're kind of getting where I'm getting on this. A good example of it being Falun Gong. That was kind of like an example there of a bit more, a little bit more contemporary in the last 50 years or so, that being outlawed, an area that was becoming too big of of an idea.
And they used to promote it, I think, like in the 90s. I think they actually promoted it, and then it got too big, and they don't like any potential challenges or competition. So they shut that down. And again, that's a whole other topic. But good. I think we covered what we needed to cover for this section. So I'm going to stop here, and then we'll continue in just a moment.